Children of the Moon by Eva Dean Brickwood. Remember the Future. Book 1. Chapter 1. A Trip to Remember. A pale half-moon watched over the commotion in the parking lot at Carter Valley Inn. It was cool this morning, but the weather could change rapidly in spring. The place was packed with impatient schoolchildren. Many of them only half listened to Dr. Broadbent's speech, and some even yawned. Why didn't they go already? Ladies and gentlemen, I hope we understand each other. Please keep in mind that under no circumstances is anyone to go near the escarpment. I fully expect to see everyone safe and sound on top of the hill by lunchtime. The principal of the Pemberton Academy for Advanced Learning, a well-known school for gifted kids, made sure that his instructions were carried out properly. Stay on the footpath. Yes, you too, over there. The culprit quickly stepped back onto the rocky footpath. Remember poor Tom Fraser? General murmur arose. They all knew that Tom Fraser had tripped and fallen off the cliff 3 years ago. Luckily, he had been okay. Sort of. There we go, Dr. Broadbent said with satisfaction. The junior grades follow Dr. Naidu and Mr. Van Straten. The senior grades line up to my left, right here. You will walk with Mrs. Meyer and Dr. Wilkins. Dr. Naidu was so short that she almost disappeared between the students in the ensuing chaos. She tried to make herself heard in a shrill voice. Victor and Brandon, come here this minute! Dr. Broadbent pushed sparse strands of hair back from his shiny forehead and began to assign the students to groups. Soon, orderly columns started to move uphill. Only 3 of the 7th graders hung back right from the start. Chryséis Cromwell seemed to have hurt her ankle and sat down on a wooden bench. Her best friends Katherine and Trevor sat down next to her, and they watched the others file past. Hey, lazy buggers, what are you still doing here? They teased the 3 friends. Chryséis pulled a face in fake pain as she rubbed her ankle and moaned. Oh, that really hurts! Chryséis Cromwell was 11, had lots of freckles on her cute nose and blonde hair that was tied up in a ponytail. Her usually bold blue eyes took on a suffering expression as soon as somebody looked her way. Catherine McDougall was 12 and rather pretty with her long auburn hair. She came from England and was as shy as a dormouse, according to the self-confident younger Chryséis, who had an opinion on absolutely everything. The 3rd conspirator was a quiet Trevor Huxley from Chicago. He was 12 like Catherine and attended Pemberton on a scholarship. It wasn't easy to get into an exclusive school like that, and it helped that Trevor was very smart. His parents had never really understood their gifted son, but a scholarship meant that they didn't have to pay for their son's education. Because of the divorce, it was just better for everyone if he went to boarding school. Trevor loved to daydream. In his thoughts, he could do as he pleased, fly on sun rays beyond the gray clouds in Chicago to the African jungle, or work on an alternative to washing machines or cruise the blue Mediterranean Sea. And when he felt like it, he could even travel back in time to ancient Rome. The 3 of them had never done anything like this before, but today they had a good reason. So they sat on the wooden bench and waited. It didn't take long for one of the teachers to approach them with a stern face to see what was going on. Of course they were prepared. Catherine grew nervous all the same and started to fidget so badly that Trevor had to shove her a couple of times. Would Dr. Wilkins buy the sore ankle, or would he notice that they were up to something? And what's that? The educator asked. Chryséis Cromwell? Shouldn't you be with your group? My foot rolled off that stone over there, Chryséis complained. It hurts. She pointed to a random stone on the ground. The teacher's expression softened and he stared at the spot. There was nothing unusual on the ground. I see, Dr. Wilkins said and scratched his long nose. Excellent student and her mother, Professor Cromwell, wrote such interesting articles in the scientific magazine. He enjoyed as a bit of light reading at bedtime. He decided to give Chryséis the benefit of the doubt and gave her an encouraging look. Chryséis was to stay at the little inn and wait for the other students to come back in the afternoon. The 2 of you, he waved Catherine and Trevor over, you come with me. Oh no, they had to stay together. According to plan, they also had to avoid cars, buildings, and especially people. Electromagnetic interference was just about the last thing they needed for their experiment. The sooner the teacher left, the better. Ahem, Dr. Wilkins, Chryséis said bravely. I'd really like to go to our picnic on the hill. Maybe we should just take it slowly. I'm sure my friends will help me. It doesn't hurt so bad anymore. See? She stood up on wobbly legs and smiled. It worked. Dr. Wilkins agreed. "All right, then," he said, and told Trevor and Katherine to look after Chryséis. Then he caught up with his group and helped a flustered Mrs. Meyer herd some of the students back to the path. Dr. Wilkins turned around briefly and saw Chryséis limping, as was to be expected, and leaning onto Trevor's arm. Then he went to the front of his group and soon disappeared behind a rock face. "Phew! At last," Katherine said, relieved. Chryséis bent down and rubbed her ankle. Then she recovered in record time. "I'm going to get lame for real if I keep this up much longer." "Okay, so now what?" Trevor stopped and scanned the hill. He pointed with his chin to some larger rocks. "See how the path kind of forks to the right over there?" "Yes, and?" Trevor had already mapped out the best site, just right for their purpose. Also rather close to the escarpment, but that couldn't be helped. "We aren't supposed to go near the edge," Katherine said immediately. Her stomach ached with nervousness. "What if we get caught? And what about Tom Fraser?" "What about him? He'd fall over his own feet when he had half a chance," Chryséis said. "Yes, but give us a break, Katie. If we don't do it today, we can forget about the whole thing." "We'll be careful." Trevor started walking. "The others won't see us for a while. At least not until they get to the top of the hill. By then, we're back on the path." "I knew that," Katherine caught up with them. "And what if we can't find a portal up there?" She was still skeptical despite weeks of careful preparations. "Oh, stop it already." Trevor was eager to get going. "Today. There has to be a time warp around here somewhere." "I guess," Katherine mumbled and trudged after them. "I found a time warp in the school garden last week, remember?" Sure, she remembered. Trevor had told them all about it, over and over. It had been his job to test the time portal finder, and what a test it had turned out to be. That was the closest description Trevor could think of for the warp and the space-time continuum. Then, behind that curtain, a vortex had opened up, churning like a washing machine during the spinning cycle, and Trevor had jumped in. Just like that. On the other side, he'd seen a large thing with shiny scales and steaming breath stretched out right before him. Creepy! The thing had moved in waves and given Trevor the grandmother of all shocks. He'd lost no time and pressed the return button and found himself back in the school garden at exactly the same point in time when he had left. The possible monster couldn't scare them off. It had been a real trip through time, no matter how short. Back at the lab, they thought up better safety features, and now it was time for the first experiment together. The experiment. They climbed over sticks and stones until they stood in front of the stone platform shielded by rocks on 3 sides and virtually invisible from the footpath. The 4th side was open toward the valley, just where they needed. "Okay, here we are," Trevor announced. "Then let's get going." Chryséis took a deep breath and jumped effortlessly onto the rock terrace. Trevor and Katherine did the same. Trevor plunked his day pack on the ground and took out a plain object that looked a bit like a flat metal pear and fit snug in the palm of his hand. The Time Portal Finder. Chryséis had dubbed the Time Portal Finder TPF, and the name had stuck. The 3 friends were proud of their handiwork. It had taken loads of time and effort to get the TPF looking like that. It had all started with Katherine's physics project, quantum physics project to be precise. The vacuum battery, an endless source of energy. At first, it hadn't even crossed her mind to use this energy source for time travel. Trevor had come up with the idea, and now they had to test the whole thing. Time travel was perfect proof that the endless energy source actually worked and wasn't just some sort of legend. Of course, the project was unusual, but they had come this far, right? This year's physics project would be a rip-roaring success. The TPF was fitted with a row of black buttons on the right side. They were there to dial the target epoch. With 3 bigger red buttons on the left, they would save reference points in time. First of all, they would have to save the time of departure. This was one of the new safety features the first model did not have. The other red buttons would be programmed with other reference point in time they liked. Kind of shortcut. Then there was a big white button right in the middle. When it was pressed, the TPF located a time warp. When it was pressed again, it activated a portal. A small display above the buttons indicated the number of years traveled. At the moment, it was set to 0. Tiny stickers under the black buttons had numbers on them, were still blank. The sticker under the red button at the top showed the date of departure, 21 February 2015. Here are all the other TPFs with their own integrated vacuum battery. 1 for each of us, here and here. Trevor handed the girls identical-looking devices in see-through plastic wraps. I put them into sandwich bags so they won't get wet. Ah, I was wondering, Katherine said. So that's what you've been up to all day yesterday. Good thinking, Trev. In case we land in the ocean or so, Chryséis quipped and let the TPF slide into her jacket pocket. Right. If we lose one or if this one here gets damaged, we still have the others as a reserve, Katherine said. Trevor carried on talking with a serious expression. The red top button is for today's time reference. We discussed that. We have to all press it at the same time when we're ready to travel. Sure thing. Now the VICs. One virtual invisibility cape for each of us. Chryséis opened the front pocket of her day pack and pulled out thin black plastic hairbands. They had a tiny box on top and a deep-set button on the side. The VIC was probably the best thing. Katherine and Chryséis had come up with the idea after Trevor's strange time travel experience. One never knew what lay in wait. In principle, it had something to do with the bending of light waves. In case of an emergency, one pressed the button and simply disappeared. Trevor wanted to put his Alice band on this morning, but that would have been just weird. Imagine a boy wearing an Alice band to the school outing? They had also decided to keep the VIC switched off inside the time portal. One never knew what might interfere with the frequency. The risk was too great. Oh, flip! The U-shaped plastic bands were entangled and Chryséis struggled to get them out of the pocket. Katherine looked worried. Hurry up, Chris. This is taking forever. Okay. In the end, Katherine helped her untangle the Alice bands. All right, then, Chryséis said with triumph in her voice. They put on their VICs, careful not to touch the flat button on the side. Can we go now? Chryséis asked, all excited. She didn't notice how pale Katherine had become. Time travel. The words echoed in Katherine's mind. Her mouth felt so dry. She swallowed hard, but the fear didn't want to go away. Now of all time she had to panic? Then a completely useless question shot through her mind. Can you breathe prehistoric air just like that, or is it dangerous? This whole experiment was insane. Dangerous, even. Katherine swallowed again and fought the urge to run. There was still time to cop out. No, it was too late. She couldn't let her friends down now. Trevor had already activated the big white button on the TPF and tried to find a good spot, pointing the TPF here and there. And sure enough, something began to shimmer by one of the gray rocks. Another curtain thing. A portal to the space-time continuum. I knew it, Trevor cried. Chryséis stared mesmerized at the shimmering spot. Time warp. This had to be a time warp. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say. All together. Now! On Trevor's signal, they pressed the red button through the plastic cover, locking in today's time reference. Done. Step 1 completed. I'm going to activate now. Get ready. The girls grabbed each other's hands and Trevor pushed the big white button a second time. Chapter 2. A New School Year. As so often, Walt the janitor had fetched Katherine and other students from the Etheridgeville airport. Time travel was pretty much the last thing on Katherine's mind as she sat comfortably in the back of the old-fashioned black Volvo. She gazed dreamily at the passing landscape while trying not to pay attention to Pravesh and Hendrik, who were having a boring discussion about sport. Looks almost like England, she thought, if one ignored the long-bearded moss swaying from the branches of eucalyptus tree. She had never seen that in England, and the sky was never such a bright blue. A tiny cloud between the trees shifted to the left as the road swerved through the broad school gate. Ah, there was another cloud not far from the first. That's more like it. Katherine sighed and settled back into the snug leather seat. As always, the holidays had been way too short. She missed her gentle French mother and dad and their comfortable home in Oxfordshire, and Aunt Trudy, Mom's sister. She was always so nice and funny. She didn't really miss her two younger brothers, Graham and Frederick. They were really naughty and bothered her endlessly. Dad was often away on business. The lingering smell of leather and cigars always reminded Katherine of him. When her dad was home, she loved to sit on his lap and listen to his deep, sonorous voice. He'd tell her fascinating stories like the one about a wedding in Pakistan he had been invited to. The bride wore a red and gold sari dress, and the groom's eyes were hidden behind a veil of gold lamenta, he had reported. Women were dancing around, balancing metal water jugs on their heads. They made Dad ride on a painted elephant. Katherine could see the scene right in front of her as she smelled the leather of the car seat. This time, Dad had been home for only 3 brief days before flying back to Hong Kong. Would things be better if her parents weren't wealthy? Sometimes all Katherine wanted was the luxury of growing up without being shipped off to boarding school. It seemed so unfair. Why couldn't she just grow up like everybody else? Well, almost everybody else. There were many kids with rich parents at Pemberton. The rambling school building, painted in rust and white with its impossible spires and towers, appeared behind the sweeping green lawns at the end of the driveway. Katherine asked herself for the umpteenth time who had thought that up. Loads of shrubs and trees dotted the Pemberton school grounds. All that exuberant vegetation kept 2 gardeners quite busy throughout the year. Murmuring water features sparkled between masses of flowers as a car purred past a 9-hole golf course. The sports facilities at Pemberton weren't to be scoffed at either. Too bad that Katherine wasn't interested in sports. They left the tennis courts behind as the car began to wind its way up the alley between high blue gum trees. Walt steered the black Volvo deftly up the broad driveway. A familiar bump in the road jolted Katherine from her dreamy mood. A red squirrel with feathery tail darted up and down the trunk of a large tree as they reached the graveled parking lot directly in front of the entrance with its sweeping stairs. Children walked around everywhere between the parked cars, while adults in smart clothes stood chatting next to piles of luggage. A familiar sight. The school magazine probably declared that Pemberton students came from all over the States, Europe, and from far-flung countries like Korea, South Africa, and New Zealand. The academy enjoyed an excellent reputation all over the world. A sobbing boy of perhaps 8 years was obviously new to the school and clung to his increasingly impatient mother. "Mom, I don't want to stay here. Mom, please!" She scolded him under her breath and pulled his clawing hands from her expensive pink designer suit. "Lester, stop it this minute. No, don't do that. Please, stop it." At the same time, she tried to make a good impression on Woody Cranick's mother, who was a fashion editor from California. Defeated, Lester sat down on his designer suitcase with a sad expression. For Katherine, there had been a few tears in the privacy of her first-class seat on the Boeing that had carried her from London to New York. By the time her connecting flight had reached Etheridgeville, Katherine's tears had dried up. After all, her parents tried to give her the best education they could afford. Nothing one could do about it, anyway. The Volvo came to a solid halt. On top of the broad steps, the great doors were flung invitingly open. "Pemberton Academy for Advanced Learning," announced a polished brass sign next to the dark wooden entrance. "Right. Here we are," Walt said. His voice was raspy like a vegetable grater. "Out with you guys. I'll get your things from the trunk in a jiffy and take them up to the entrance hall." Walt was an amicable fellow with gray, wiry hair. He had been the janitor, chauffeur, and supervisor of staff forever, even longer than the fat cook, Mrs. Hadley, and proud to be an employee of importance. He admired Dr. Broadbent and was fond of the students. Well, most of them. He appreciated it if they didn't trample on his flowers or played fountain with the water hoses. Water was expensive these days. "Too clever for their own good, some of those kids are," Walt thought to himself and opened the trunk of the car. "Just too clever." Katherine and the 2 boys jumped onto the crunching gravel. She felt hot in her woolen skirt and twin set. They were more suitable for the cool British weather than the much warmer Georgia. Then it didn't matter anymore. Katherine had detected Chryséis and Trevor. Trevor stood in a group of boys close by. They were telling stories about their holidays. Chryséis held the hand of her colorfully dressed mom. Most of the kids wouldn't be seen dead holding their mom's hand, but Chryséis couldn't be bothered with other people's opinions. Professor Cromwell was a bit eccentric, but other than that, really nice. Not like many of the other rather square parents. The 3 friends shared an interest in quantum physics and global warming and were in the top 10 of their grade. This year, they would be in 7th grade. 7th grade sounded so grown up. Trevor was glad to be back at school after a never-ending holiday. He had spent the first 2 weeks cooped up in his dad's small flat in Chicago, the Windy City, with his new computer. His dad never spoke much and it had been too cold to go outside. The few friends he still had there were on vacation. Trevor knew that his dad meant well, but they were just light years apart. His parents had been divorced by the time Trevor was 3, and he began to spend much time with his beloved grandmother. Granny had nursed him when he had broken his arm as a little boy. They went for walks in the park, and she had made up the most amazing stories. Then Granny had died 2 years ago of pneumonia in the cold of winter, and Trevor felt so lonely, as if he had lost his entire family right then.